Welcome back to the Sleepy Horror Vault, a place where real-life mysteries, forgotten legends, and haunted memories are reborn as quiet bedtime stories. Our goal is simple: to help you fall asleep faster and deeper with specially designed music and narration that eases your mind into the shadows. Tonight's story takes us back to California in 1978, to a case that still disturbs even the most seasoned investigators. 5 young men, 1 car, a snow-covered mountain road, and a mystery that ends in silence, fear, and death. This is a chilling true tale of the Yuba County 5. Close your eyes, take a deep breath, and let the darkness take care of the rest.
Chapter 1. The Last Drive. The air in Yuba City was cool that night, colder than usual for late February in California's Central Valley. Streetlights buzzed over quiet suburban blocks, casting long shadows across sidewalks as the final hours of Friday settled in. In a modest neighborhood home, 5 young men were preparing for a short road trip. They weren't troublemakers or thrill seekers. They were friends, close as brothers, and tonight was supposed to be fun. Jack Madruga, 30 years old, had volunteered to drive. His 1969 Mercury Montego, turquoise and white, was polished and ready. Jack was proud of that car. He never let anyone else drive it, not even Gary. He was quiet, reliable, and fiercely protective of the group. In the passenger seat would sit Bill Sterling, 29, always quick with a joke, a little older than the rest but gentle in nature. Behind them, Ted Weiher, 32, a tall man with a slow smile and an infectious laugh. Jack Hewitt, 24, childlike in spirit, who looked up to Ted like a big brother. And Gary Mathias, 25, sharp-witted, talkative, and more complex than most knew. Gary was the wild card. He suffered from schizophrenia but had been stable for years, managing his condition with medication and support. Together they formed an unusual but loyal team. They called themselves the Gateway Gators, named after the vocational rehabilitation center they all attended. Their shared passion was basketball. Not watching it, playing it. They had a big game coming up, part of a Special Olympics tournament in Sacramento. The winner would get a free trip to Los Angeles. They were excited. Ted had laid out his uniform that morning. So had the others. Everything was ready. But first they were going to Chico State to watch a college game. UC Davis versus Chico. Just for fun. Just a short ride north, maybe grab some snacks, then back before midnight. At 5:45 p.m., they climbed into the Montego and pulled away from the curb. Jack's driving was smooth, steady. Gary tuned the radio, skipping between pop songs and static. The mood was light. There was laughter in the car as the city lights faded behind them. They reached Chico without incident. Several eyewitnesses would later recall seeing them at the game. Nothing unusual. They cheered, clapped, nudged each other with excitement when plays got intense. They were, by all accounts, happy. The game ended a little after 10 p.m. They left the arena, walked calmly back to the car, and then nothing. That was the last time anyone ever saw the Yuba County 5 alive. They never returned home. By Saturday morning, their families were worried. These weren't men who wandered off. They had routines, structures. They didn't stay out late. Especially not the night before a game they had been excited about for weeks. When they failed to show up at the tournament, panic set in. Calls were made. Searches began. But no one knew where to look. The route from Chico to Yuba City was straightforward. Just a highway drive back south. But they weren't on that road. 2 days later, on Monday, police found Jack's car abandoned nearly 70 miles away. Up in the remote, snowy highlands of Plumas National Forest near Oroville. A place none of them had any reason to go. The car was in good condition. Not stuck. The tires weren't buried. The keys were gone, but the doors were unlocked, windows partially rolled down. Inside, they found programs from the game, snack wrappers, and maps folded neatly in the glove compartment. But no footprints led away from the vehicle. No signs of struggle or distress. It was as if they had simply stepped out into the darkness and disappeared. The area was treacherous that time of year. Locals avoided those roads in winter. Snowdrifts could swallow a man whole. Nights dipped below freezing. Wildlife roamed the trees. Why had they driven up there? Jack's family was adamant he hated the cold. He would never have taken the car off paved roads, especially not into the mountains. Bill's parents agreed. None of them had any experience with the wilderness. They weren't hikers. They weren't prepared for those conditions. Gary knew better than most how quickly things could spiral when you lost control. He had served in the military, stationed in West Germany before his mental illness forced a discharge. He was street smart, capable. Not the type to blindly follow a bad decision. But there were no answers, only theories. Some believed they had taken a wrong turn, though that made little sense given how far off course they were. Others speculated they had tried to help someone, maybe seen a car stranded and stopped. A woman with a baby. A man waving for help. Something that pulled at their good nature and trust. But if that were the case, where was that person now? The days passed. Helicopters searched from above. Deputies on snowmobiles combed the forest trails. Flyers were posted across the region. But nature remained silent. Then something even stranger happened. A forest ranger reported an unusual scene weeks later, far from the car. What appeared to be small food wrappers scattered deep in the woods. A trail of them, like someone had been dropping them while walking, or luring someone else to follow. But the snow had covered everything by then. The prints, the trail, the context, gone. By March, hope began to fade. The families were breaking. Gary's stepfather walked the woods himself with a flashlight and a .22 rifle, calling his name. Ted's mother stopped answering the phone, afraid of what she might hear next. Jack's mother refused to take down his uniform. And still, no trace. It wasn't until June, nearly 4 months later, that the first real answer would come. But by then it was far too late to bring them home. Chapter 2. The Discovery. Spring came late to the Plumas National Forest. Even in June, patches of snow clung stubbornly to the shadowed slopes, nestled beneath towering pines and firs that blocked out the warming sun. Streams ran high with meltwater, and the air smelled of wet bark and distant cold. It was beautiful, hauntingly so. But beneath that beauty, something rotten waited to be found. On June 4, 1978, 4 months after the Yuba County 5 had vanished, a group of weekend motorcyclists was riding along a remote service road near an abandoned U.S. Forest Service trailer. The trail was rough and barely navigable. They weren't looking for anything, just adventure, a little snow left to cut through, and a view before turning back. But one of them stopped. Something wasn't right. There was a smell in the air, faint but distinct. Not the usual musk of forest decay. It was sour, unnatural, something that tugged at the oldest part of the brain and whispered, "Something is dead." They dismounted and approached the trailer. The door was slightly ajar. Inside they found a nightmare. Lying on a cot, wrapped tightly in wool military blankets, was the body of Ted Weiher. He was stretched out as if asleep, arms at his sides, head resting on a pillow. But his face was gaunt, his skin pale and drawn tight over bone. He had lost nearly half his body weight. His beard had grown out. His feet were black with frostbite. His eyes were closed. He had died slowly. There was food in the trailer: canned goods, freeze-dried meals, powdered milk. Dozens of rations, more than enough to survive for weeks. There were matches, heavy clothing, books, and even a propane tank attached to a heater that had never been lit. Ted had been there for a long time. Maybe 8 weeks. Maybe more. But he hadn't eaten. Or if he had, it had only been the bare minimum. On a small table beside him were open cans of beans and fruit. But most of the food remained untouched. He hadn't tried to break a window to let in light or signal for help. He hadn't used the heater. He had simply waited. A search team was called in immediately, and within days, more remains were discovered. Roughly 11 miles away from where the Mercury Montego had been abandoned, the bodies of Bill Sterling and Jack Madruga were found, scattered across the forest floor, partially consumed by wildlife. Jack still had his keys in his pocket. The distance they had traveled was staggering, through deep snow, rough terrain, and with no clear destination. No trail, no logic. Further down the same area, the spine of Jack Hewitt was discovered near a stream. A few pieces of clothing, some bones, nothing more. He had died alone, not far from the others. And yet somehow no one had heard a scream. No one had seen anything. Gary Mathias, the fifth man, was never found. All that remained were a few of his shoes, discovered inside the trailer where Ted's body lay. Shoes that didn't belong to Ted. Shoes placed there deliberately as if swapped or left behind. The official reports were cautious. Hypothermia. Disorientation. Maybe paradoxical undressing. A known phenomenon where those freezing begin to feel warm and remove clothing, hastening their own deaths. But that didn't explain the trailer. That didn't explain the food. The heater. The untouched supplies. The watch that didn't belong to any of them. The fact that Ted's body was carefully wrapped, as if by a friend who cared. It didn't explain why they had abandoned a functioning car. Why they walked 20 miles into the woods in the middle of the night, wearing street clothes and thin jackets. And it didn't explain Gary's complete disappearance. The families were furious, heartbroken, confused. Gary's stepfather told a reporter that he believed they had been chased, that someone had led them off the road and into the forest, that they had tried to hide. Maybe from the police, maybe from something worse. There's more to this, he said. They didn't just get lost. Some believed the group had been caught in a panic, that Gary, in a moment of psychosis, had convinced them to flee into the woods. But those who knew him rejected that. He had been stable, clear-headed, determined to play in the tournament. Others whispered darker things. One of the deputies, off the record, said he'd seen strange things up there over the years. Lights in the trees, radios picking up voices that weren't there, tracks that ended abruptly like something had taken off into the air. Another man, a ranger who had worked the area for 2 decades, said only one sentence before refusing further interviews. They weren't alone out there. His voice trembled when he said it. But none of this made it into the final reports. Officially, the Yuba County 5 were listed as a tragic accident. A story of 5 vulnerable men who got lost, made poor decisions and succumbed to nature. But there were no answers for the contradictions. Why would Ted starve in a trailer full of food? Why did Gary vanish entirely as if he had never been there at all? Why did they travel so far uphill in freezing conditions without a reason? And who wrapped Ted in the blankets? The mountain had kept their secrets for months. And though it had returned some of their bodies, it never returned the truth. Gary's file remains open. His name remains in the system. Some say he's still out there, hiding in the forest, mind broken, body lost. Others believe he made it out, and something followed. Chapter 3. The Sixth Presence. The mountain didn't just take. It watched. That was the feeling searchers couldn't shake as they moved deeper into the Plumas wilderness. Even weeks after the bodies were found, the forest still felt wrong. Not just because of what had happened, but because of what hadn't. The silence wasn't the usual kind, the peaceful hush of remote trees and snow. It was listening, breathing with something unseen. Deputy Russell McKay had worked missing persons for over a decade. He had found hikers, drunks, runaways. But he had never seen anything like this. The trailer, the way the car was left, the strange distances between each body, as if they had scattered but not in panic. More like they were being arranged. And then there were the reports no one wanted to include in the files. A week before the trailer was discovered, a park ranger doing routine snow measurements had picked up static on his radio. Not unusual in the mountains, but beneath the static something strange had crackled through. A voice. Male. Come. Repeating a phrase over and over. They said wait here. We wait. They said wait here. It had faded after less than a minute. He never told anyone at first, chalking it up to interference. But when the bodies were found, when Ted Weiher was found lying peacefully in a trailer, as if he had been waiting for something, he broke. And he wasn't the only one. An elderly couple driving along a service road in late February reported seeing headlights weaving through the forest, far off the main trail. The lights didn't behave normally. They didn't bounce or flicker like those from a car. They glided, smooth and slow. When the husband honked in warning, the lights blinked out instantly, gone without a sound. Those sightings too were never followed up. The official story was becoming more fragile by the day. And then came the footprints. About 3 miles north of the trailer, a local logger hiking through thinning snow found what looked like partial tracks. Deep impressions half melted as if someone had been walking barefoot through snowdrifts. But they were spaced strangely. Wide strides far too long for a man. And they led to nowhere. They simply ended. No turns. No stumble marks. Just gone. When investigators were shown the area days later, a ranger with them made an offhand comment. "That's not a trail. That's a landing." Everyone laughed nervously, but no one joked twice. Back at the sheriff's office, there was talk behind closed doors. Gary Mathias was still missing. But those who'd been to the trailer felt sure of one thing. Ted hadn't wrapped himself in those blankets. He hadn't arranged the cans around him. Someone had cared for him, stayed with him. Someone was with him. The coroner estimated Ted lived at least 8 weeks after they disappeared. But the food, even untouched as it was, would not have lasted that long for just one man. And Gary's shoes were inside the trailer. His tennis shoes, worn, damp, lined up neatly by the door. So where had he gone? Who had he followed? And what about the gold watch found beside the cot? One that didn't belong to any of the 5. Gary's family clung to hope. His mother believed he had simply wandered off. Maybe amnesiac, maybe afraid. His stepfather, however, believed something darker. He told reporters quietly but firmly that Gary had told him stories in the past. Stories about things he'd seen during his worst episodes. Not hallucinations. Not delusions. Warnings. He had spoken once of a man with no face who stood at the edge of his vision during his time in the army, especially in the woods during night patrols. A figure that never moved, never spoke, but filled him with panic. A presence. A watcher. A thing that waited. His stepfather had written it off as psychosis. Now he wasn't so sure. He began searching again, not in the woods but in old army files, in Gary's journals, in symbols he didn't understand. He found something in one of Gary's notebooks. A crude sketch of a trailer, 5 stick figures in a line, and a 6th shape looming above them. No face. No arms. Just tall. And hovering. Underneath, a single word: obey. Investigators never saw that page. His mother burned it. But the memory stuck. There were people in the town who believed something had followed them up that mountain. Not a killer. Not a cult. Not an accident. Something older. Something that didn't kill, at least not in the way we think. Something that wanted fear. That waited in the snow, in the trees. That pulled people off the path and made them forget where they were going. Something that needed 5. Or 6. The 6th presence. Was it Gary? Or something else? Chapter 4. Something in the trees. Long before the 5 young men ever set foot in those woods, locals knew better than to stay up there after dark. It wasn't superstition, it was experience. Quiet things. Small things. Things people didn't talk about in town because they sounded too ridiculous once spoken aloud. Things like hearing footsteps in the snow that never left tracks. Seeing a deer freeze in place for minutes at a time, like it was listening to something you couldn't hear. Like it was waiting to see if you'd noticed them. They called it a bad patch of forest. Not cursed exactly, but watched. Guarded. Like the trees themselves were aware of you. No one ever said this on the record. But when the story of the Yuba County 5 hit the papers, something old stirred beneath the surface. People who'd lived up there all their lives, retired loggers, forest workers, recluses, began quietly visiting the sheriff's department. They didn't come with theories. They came with warnings. One of them was Joseph Kleiner, a former fire lookout now in his 70s. He'd worked the mountain tower back in the 50s, a solitary job that gave him more hours alone with the woods than any man should have. His face was like dried leather and his voice came slow. But when he spoke, deputies leaned in. He told them about a night in 1954 when a boy had gone missing near the same area. 11 years old. Vanished from a family picnic just before sundown. They found his shoes a week later, set neatly beneath a tree. Nothing else. No tracks. No body. No struggle. Same as Gary Mathias. Kleiner said, "You don't see it. You just know it's watching. Like standing near a cliff you can't see. Something knows you're close to the edge. At the time, they dismissed it as the ramblings of an old man. But now, with 4 bodies recovered, 1 still missing and no logical explanation to be found, they were listening. Another man came forward. Tomas Delgado, 42, lived off-grid 2 miles from the service trailer. His cabin was surrounded by motion sensors and homemade wind chimes fashioned from old tin. When officers visited him during the initial search, he was hostile, claimed they were stirring up what should be left alone. He never told them what he meant. But weeks later, after the trailer was found, he left a letter in the night mailbox at the sheriff's office. It wasn't signed, but they knew his handwriting. The letter read, "There is a place beyond the creek where no sound carries. You'll know it when you step there because the forest goes quiet like it's holding its breath. I've heard my own voice echo back wrong. Not delayed, wrong. Like something else was pretending to be me." The boys. "I think they reached that place. Don't go looking for the 6th one. If he's still there, he's not the same anymore." The letter was never released to the public. But the mention of the 6th one chilled the few officers who read it. Because by then whispers had already started. In May, a group of seasonal workers clearing trails near the far edge of the forest, closer to the Feather River, reported hearing a man shouting from the trees. They said it didn't sound like panic, more like commands, as if he were speaking to someone. When they called out, the voice stopped. There were no footprints, nothing on the radios. The forest swallowed the sound like water. One of the workers, a Navajo man named Eli, refused to go back. He told his foreman the place felt hollow, like walking into a space that had been scooped out of the world and stitched back in wrong. He used a word his grandfather had once taught him. Nilchai Dine, the ones who live in the wind, the unseen. Later that month, hikers claimed they found strange carvings in the bark of several trees. Not initials, but symbols. Circles within circles. Sharp forked lines. One of the trees had what looked like 5 small handprints pressed into the trunk, and a 6th larger above them. The tree was located less than 400 yards from where the Montego had been abandoned. The rangers removed it quietly. Even the dog teams refused to work certain sections of the forest. Trained bloodhounds brought in to track Gary Mathias became agitated near the boundary of an old mining trail. They barked, refused to move forward. Their handler said it was like they were smelling something that scared them. Not a bear, not a cougar. Something wrong. And still, nothing official. The public was told the case was closed. The families were told their sons had died tragically, lost in the woods due to poor judgment, hypothermia, confusion. End of story. But one mother, Ted Wyhers, refused to believe it. He went up there herself, took her son's photo, walked the edges of the forest where the snow had melted, left pieces of his childhood behind. A shoelace, a baseball cap, a picture of their family dog. She said she hoped something would recognize him and let go. She never spoke to the press. But her niece later told a reporter that after that visit she didn't dream anymore. Not once. Not of Ted. Not of anything. Just black. So, like the trees had taken even her dreams. Chapter 5. The Man Who Didn't Scream. Of all the strange things in the Yuba County 5 case, one detail never stopped bothering those who studied it closely. Ted Wyher lived for weeks after they vanished, maybe even 2 months. Long enough to lose weight. Long enough for his beard to grow. Long enough to open a few cans of food, and then simply stop. He had everything he needed to survive, yet he withered in silence. And he never screamed. Not once. Even in the final stages of starvation, when the body begs for warmth and food, when the mind begins to hallucinate, he made no attempt to break a window to light the heater to eat more. He didn't scavenge or claw at the walls. He lay still, quiet, like he was waiting for something, or obeying. The coroner described the scene as peaceful, but investigators found that word unsettling. There was no peace in that place. Only silence. A silence too heavy to be natural. And then came the phone call. 2 weeks after the trailer was discovered, a woman named Linda Tolman called the sheriff's office from a gas station payphone outside of Brownsville, California, roughly 40 miles from the site. She refused to give her real name at first. Her voice was shaking. She said, "I think I saw one of those boys." The deputy asked when. "2 nights ago," she said. "At the edge of the woods near my property." The deputy was about to dismiss it. There had been dozens of false sightings, but something in her tone made him pause. She continued, "I was bringing in firewood just after sunset. I heard someone walking in the leaves. Thought it was a deer. But then I saw him, standing just past the tree line. Thin. Not saying a word. Just watching." She described him. Tall, beard overgrown, wearing what looked like army boots and a gray jacket. He didn't approach. He didn't run. He just looked at her. And then he smiled. But it wasn't right. "I don't know how to explain it," she said, voice cracking. It was like he was trying to smile, like he remembered what it meant, but his eyes weren't part of it. She ran inside, locked the door, and when she looked again, he was gone. She recognized the face from the paper the next day. Gary Mathias. Deputies combed the area. Found nothing. No footprints. No broken branches. No one at the neighboring houses saw anything. Linda refused to talk to the press, and her name never made it into any official file. But she wasn't the only one. Over the next month, 2 more people reported seeing someone who looked like Gary near the edges of different towns. Once in Woodleaf, once closer to the eastern slopes. Same story. Quiet man, gaunt, standing alone. He never spoke. Never approached. Never screamed. A trucker passing through a rest stop in Oroville said he saw a man at the vending machines just after midnight. When he asked if he was okay, the man turned slowly and said, "Still waiting." Then walked away. Still waiting. Same words that came through on the radio transmission back in March. The one the ranger had caught briefly through the static. The reports were buried quickly. The official stance was that Gary had perished in the woods like the others. His body simply never recovered. But in private, some believed he had gotten out. Or something had. Deputy McKay kept returning to one detail. Gary's shoes had been found inside the trailer, dry and neatly placed by the door. But Ted's feet were frozen, wrapped in rags. If Gary had walked out, where had he gone barefoot? And how did he survive? Even if he had reached the edge of the forest, he would have been skeletal, disoriented, starving. And yet the witnesses all said the same thing. He didn't look confused. He looked calm. Too calm. Like someone who knew exactly where he was going. In July, a body was found near an abandoned shed 15 miles southeast of the trailer. The face was too decomposed to identify. Animals had done their work. But the clothes matched none of the boys. The watch on his wrist was cracked, the time frozen at 3:19. In his hand, clenched tight even in death, was a small piece of crumpled paper. It had writing on it. Not words. Just a repeated shape. Circles. Inside circles. The same symbol carved into the bark near the Mercury Montego. DNA testing was inconclusive. The remains were never officially identified as Gary Mathias. But unofficially, those who had seen what was left of the face said the jawline matched. So did the teeth. What didn't match was the feeling the body gave off. "You ever see something that looks like a man?" one searcher said quietly, "but doesn't feel like one?" The body was cremated. No funeral was held. The family was told it wasn't him. But his mother, who had stopped speaking months ago, began humming an old song he used to play on the piano. A song she hadn't heard in 20 years. He hummed it every night for a week. Then she stopped. When asked why, she simply said, "He told me not to." She never said anything else. And she never dreamed again. Chapter 6. The One Who Called Them. The mountain was quiet again. The snow had melted. The trees had thickened with green. The paths that once held echoes of search dogs, helicopter blades, and grief now lay silent, as if the forest had swallowed the story completely. But some things remained. Unmarked. Buried. Waiting. In a locked filing cabinet in the Yuba County Sheriff's Department, Cabinet 5B to be exact, sat a folder that didn't exist in the official index. Its tab was unmarked. Inside were photocopies, hand-scribbled notes, and 3 Polaroid photographs. all paperclipped together with a slip that simply read, "For review. Do not release." No one could say for sure who had filed it, but Deputy McKay remembered the day it appeared. June 21, 1979, a full year after the case had gone cold. It arrived in an unmarked envelope. No return address. Inside was a cassette tape and a map. The tape was old, warped slightly by heat. It crackled with static and faint distortion. But as McKay played it in the evidence room, a coldness settled in his chest. First it was just a hum, like wind over wires. Then came a voice. Soft, male, familiar. "I didn't mean to bring them here." The voice trembled. Not with fear, with guilt. They said it was a light, but it wasn't. "I thought it was just something in the trees. I thought it was a joke." Silence. Then, "They follow sound. They mimic it. They sound like people. They sound like your friends." Pause. "I was the one who said we should help. The woman on the road. The baby. I saw them." Static again. Then something that didn't belong on tape. Something under the hiss, almost like breathing. Wet. Slow. McKay stopped the tape, but it took him hours to stop shaking. The map that came with it showed the Plumas National Forest with certain points circled. Not where the car was found. Not where the trailer was. Deeper. Off the logging trails. Near old survey markers from the 1940s. Places no one went anymore. At the center of it all was a single word, scrawled in red. Return. The handwriting didn't match any of the 5. And the voice, whoever it was, had never been identified. But McKay had his suspicion. Gary Mathias. Or what was left of him. By then, the sheriff's department was under pressure to move on. The public had lost interest. The forest had gone quiet. But McKay kept digging even when it cost him his job. He found another clue, one no one had connected before. A park ranger's notebook from 1976, 2 years before the boys disappeared, mentioned a report from hikers claiming to hear someone calling for help near the Feather River Basin. They had followed the voice, but each time they got closer, it moved farther ahead. They never found the source. The ranger dismissed it at the time, but when McKay tracked him down years later, he admitted something strange. He too had heard it once. "It was calling my name," he said. The voice didn't belong to anyone he knew, but it knew his name. That detail came up again and again. In old reports, in off-the-record interviews, people who wandered into that stretch of forest sometimes heard voices. Not just any voices, familiar ones. Voices of people they trusted. Dead relatives, friends, themselves. And always it led them deeper in. McKay began to think the Yuba County 5 had never meant to go to the mountains. That someone or something had led them, called them. The woman with the baby. A figure on the roadside. A gliding light. The sound of someone in need. Whatever it was, it didn't take them all at once. It made them walk. Made them split up. Made them suffer. Like it needed that fear. Like it fed on the slow unraveling of the mind. Ted had waited in silence. The others had died along the trail. And maybe Gary had become part of it. Or maybe he was still trying to warn them. That's what haunted McKay in the end. He listened to the tape 100 times. And on the 87th playthrough he swore he heard something faint beneath the voice just for a second. 5 names, whispered, one after the other. And then a 6th. One that wasn't in the case file. One that didn't belong. His own. Plug. Years passed. The file stayed cold. Gary Mathias remained missing, at least on paper. The mountain, quiet once again, reclaimed its roads. Trees grew over old trails. The service trailer was eventually dismantled. Locals stopped talking. Outsiders forgot. But the families never did. Jack Madruga's mother kept a photo of him by the window until the day she died. Ted's brother stopped hiking. Gary's stepfather never sold his truck, always keeping it gassed up in case he got the call. But it never came. Officially, the case was closed. Unofficially, it never really ended. Strange reports continued to surface. Not often, but enough. A camper heard voices calling in the night near Forbestown Ridge. A hunter found fresh footprints in the snow. barefoot, wide set, no sign of return. A Forest Service worker discovered a symbol carved into a rock where no one should have been. A circle inside a circle. No one followed up. And then, in 1992, a tape arrived at a local radio station in Marysville. No label. No note. They never aired it. Too distorted, too eerie. But the station manager, curious, played it alone one night. He swore he heard breathing. And 5 names. Then a 6th. And then his own. They say he quit the next day. Moved out of state. Never said goodbye. Somewhere in those woods, something still lingers. Not a ghost. Not a killer. Just a presence. A question without a mouth. A call without a voice. Still waiting. Still watching. Still listening.
The story is over now. And by now, I imagine you're already asleep. Drifting somewhere quiet, somewhere familiar, maybe even a street you almost remember. But if you're still awake, that's okay too. Just breathe slowly. Let the weight of the day fade away. The music you're hearing is designed to help you fall asleep faster and sink deeper into rest. Even if strange dreams follow, there are no more tapes tonight. No more humming, just your body relaxing and your mind slipping softly into sleep. Thank you for spending your night with us, here in the Sleepy Horror Vault. Until next time, sweet dreams.